Is there anybody who would like to actually entertain Dr. Claros for additional questions here? Okay. If not, then maybe I should actually start a bit. Okay. I'm actually very interested a while ago when you're talking about the idea of the new challenges, and there's still a big question. Okay, that what and then how should we continue? Since like we only talk, right? Most of the time, even the case of the G8 to the G20 and to the case of maybe 22 afterwards, okay? We can actually combine the case of different people coming in together, different countries in together, but finally it's just talk most of the time, okay? So how should the case of these different countries like us or even developing economies like Asia, okay, help contribute in this part to push things to be much more, realistic?
You know that there is a professor at Columbia University. His name is Richard Falk, a very, very well-known, well-respected about political scientist. And about 15 years ago, he wrote a paper which had a kind of a very provocative title, and it was published in a magazine called Foreign Affairs. It's a journal. It's the leading foreign affairs journal in the world. And the title of the article was Toward World Parliament. Toward World Parliament. And he made a kind of a number of interesting points, and I think that they address your question in a very interesting way. He said that in the old times, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s, there was something there was something that he called the old diplomacy. The old diplomacy, and the old diplomacy essentially said, okay, we have a problem, and governments are going to come together. They're going to work. They're going to negotiate some kind of treaty, some kind of agreement, and this problem is going to be solved. And he said that because of globalization, because of integration, that old diplomacy is no longer working. We cannot rely on it to solve our problems because our problems have become much more complex in nature. And so he said, now that we have the new diplomacy, and in the new diplomacy, it is really many different stakeholders coming together. It's governments, it's the business community, and especially it's civil society. And by these groups coming together, the possibilities of solutions, creative solutions, are enhanced. And so he gave a few examples. He said, for instance, you may think that this is small, but I don't think it is such a small initiative. There was a campaign to ban landmines. You know what are landmines, right? These are sort of explosive devices which are left on the ground in countries that have had civil conflicts and other kinds of wars, and then they explode years later when a child is walking by in an agricultural field and they blow off his legs, right? And there was a serious problem in the 1990s because we were coming out of a period of many conflicts in many different parts of the world, and so it was a very serious problem. Well, this woman, this housewife, somewhere in the East United States, began a campaign. It was a civil society campaign. She created a small NGO and began to say, shouldn't we negotiate a treaty that would actually address this problem? And eventually, she got the endorsement of the Canadian government, and the Canadian government hosted a big conference, and they actually drafted a treaty, and eventually, they got more than 120 countries to sign this treaty, and to a great extent, we solved what was then a very serious problem, in many different parts of the world, right? And so Richard Falk gave this as an example of how civil society, because of communications, because of the internet, because of the kind of communications revolution, has been empowered politically in a way that would have been unthinkable in the 1950s and 1960s and even in the 1970s, right? So here you have one example, but he gave a couple of other examples. He said that the Kyoto Protocol, although, as I have indicated, it was a failure in terms of achieving what we wanted to achieve for emissions, it was actually a success in terms of international cooperation, because the Kyoto Protocol would not have happened if it hadn't been with the participation of civil society and the business community as well. as advocates, for this problem. So, my answer to your question basically is that we citizens need to be much more active than we have been in the past historically in terms of pushing in working in terms of the search for global solutions. We mustn't just expect our governments to be the key players, because our governments are impotent. They are worried, they're concerned about much more urgent, sort of near-term problems having to do with the economy, having to do with poverty, having to do with all kinds of other social and political issues, migration, etc., right? So there is a much important role for civil society in the search for solutions, right? Now, at a more individual level, I think that to the extent that we reflect in our own personal values this idea, right? The earth is what one country and mankind is citizens. To the extent that we do away with our prejudices, to the extent that we, in our relationships with our friends, with our family, with our co-workers, with citizens in our country, with citizens elsewhere in other parts of the world, begin to behave as citizens of one common fatherland, as brothers and sisters of one common human family, that will also contribute to a shift in consciousness, a shift in the values that we have, and that will create a more fertile ground, for governments and other key players, to find solutions to these problems. So there is also a role for the individual, right?
Mm-hmm. Seems like we have a good question, an answer there. Oh, another question.
Mr. Director, what I would like to know if from those problems, how would affect the economic growth of the global in a long term, say 10 years from now? Is there any negative effect? How large or how small?
You know that one idea that I think you will agree was implicit in my presentation is how problems interact with each other, right? With increasing complexity, things are much more dependent on each other, and they affect each other in various ways, right? So I have no doubt that, for instance, climate change is going to interact with the economy in many different ways. Just think extreme weather events, right? Shocks to the system associated with storms and with very high temperatures and with hurricanes and so on. They already are having an impact in terms of pressures on the budget. A couple of years ago, there was a storm, a hurricane that affected the eastern United States, New York especially, and some of the neighboring states. It was called Sandy. You probably remember, it was very much in the news at the time. And it caused a great deal of destruction. There were parts of New York City that had no light, no electricity for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. My editor, I work with a publishing house in New York. My editor came to visit me in Washington, and she told me that for 2 weeks, she had no electricity in her apartment, which basically meant she couldn't take a shower, she couldn't do anything really. She lived up on one of these high rises, and with no electricity, essentially your apartment becomes unlivable. Right? You cannot flush the toilet, you cannot take a shower, you cannot drink water, there's nothing you can do. So she said, I used to sleep there, and then every day I would have to go and visit a friend who lived, several blocks away, and that's where I would take a shower and use the toilet and so on. And so there you have, something that sometimes seems very abstract, which is climate change, affecting the daily life of a common citizen in a very dramatic way. So do I believe that the global economy is on a path sustained prosperity and high economic growth for the next 10, 15, 20 years? No, I don't. Right? I think that's I hope it happens, because I think that rising incomes and rising prosperity is good, but I don't myself believe that it will happen, because I think that we have all kinds of potential vulnerabilities which are going to shock our system in important ways, right? I'm reading a biography written a couple of years ago by a professor in the United States, of a very, very distinguished American by the name of Granville Clark. Granville Clark was a very famous lawyer and professor of law at Harvard Law School. And in 1958, together with another professor at the law school, he wrote a book called World Peace Through World Law. And it was a fascinating treatise, but Clark, who was an advisor, a very close advisor of Franklin Roosevelt at the time that the United Nations was created, Clark wanted to create a United Nations with much greater authority, much greater jurisdiction. He essentially wanted to give the United Nations the ability to monitor and to control all nuclear weapons, all weapons of mass destruction. Because Clark was fearful that in a world of sovereign nations, where every nation is basically not thinking about the common interest, but is simply defending their national interests, with access to these horrible technologies of mass destruction, which are nuclear weapons, we were basically running the risk that eventually, in time, in the middle of some crisis, these weapons will actually be used. And he said, that would potentially mean the end of humanity, the end of, or at least so much devastation and so much suffering and so much destabilization that it would make World War II look, mild by comparison, right? So Clark spent the last 20 years of his life, working for the purpose of reforming the United Nations to give it authority over armaments, right? So we need to confront these global issues, not only because it is the right thing to do, but also because if we don't, then there will be problems on the economic side as well. When we were driving with Edward from my hotel this morning for this visit, we were, it was a long ride, rush hour in Bangkok, right? I'm beginning to understand it better, one of the things I was telling him was that one of the concerns I have about the current global economic situation is that we no longer have the ability for the kinds of large-scale interventions that we did in 2008 and 2009 during the last global financial crisis, right? Which basically involved a huge deal of spending. Governments brought out packages of fiscal stimulus. Governments intervened in the banking system. They recapitalized the banks and spent a great deal of money to mitigate the impact of the crisis and to soften its effects, to protect segments of the population that were particularly affected by it, and so on and so forth, right? And so a typical case is what happened in Spain. Spain in 2007 had levels of public debt in relation to GDP of 37%. Spain today has levels of public debt in relation to GDP of 100%, which is nearly 3 times more, right? And so the question I ask to you is, if we have another crisis a couple of years from now, how prepared will Spain be to react to that crisis? And my answer to that question is not so well prepared as they were in 2007, because now How much more can they spend if debt levels are already at 100% of GDP? How easily can they persuade the bond markets, please lend us $50 billion because we have a crisis today? Right? They were able to do that successfully in 2008. I think would be less able to do it today. And that's just one example. That's Spain. A similar argument can be made for the United States, where public debt has also risen dramatically, right? And so we are in a much more vulnerable situation. We have used a lot of our ammunition during the last crisis, and if we have another crisis in a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or however many years, it's going to find us in a much weaker position to respond to that crisis because of our very high levels of indebtedness today, right? And so, I guess my answer to your question is, I do have concerns. I think that we are in a very vulnerable situation, and I think that that should be an encouragement for us to begin to act and to begin to think in sort of in the bigger picture in the way that I have argued for today. We'll give the lady first, and then you come.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the interesting lecture. I was just wondering, the principle of one race, one mankind, one common interest. It sounds very good, and that's what we should be aiming for. And maybe even EU was formed based on one of that principle too. But it's been repeatedly proved in the world that some countries, take advantage of other because of this basic principle of common interest. Some countries are not properly governed, and they make bad decisions, and therefore other countries are forced to bail them out. And so these principles, because of these experiences, it shows that this common interest and common mankind benefit doesn't really work in the real world. So I want to know your opinion on this, like Spain, Greece, and Germany has to suffer, France has to suffer because of that. So it doesn't work, because what do you think about this?
And then let's take up a second question.
A few questions, Professor. One thing is you mentioned about the war government. Now, Putin in Russia, Donald Trump going to be president in America. And how are they going to solve the problem? I see many crises because of these leaders. That's one thing I want to ask. Another is, also mentioned about the EU, which is very successful. But we have in ASEAN Union, which is non-interference. They never do anything, just talking. 10 countries, one community, but never solve the problems. In Burma, in Bangladesh, they don't do it. So I just want to know what is happening. Another is about the social security. You say to increase the age up to 80 years, 75 years. We are having a problem in Thailand, in Japan always. Is there any other solutions? Plus, instead of increasing the age, any other solutions? Thank you very much.
To your question, you know that I've actually studied quite a bit sort of the European experiment, the history of the European Union. And at the moment, today, there is a lot of pessimism. The United Kingdom just 6 months ago voted to leave the European Union. And just now they are actually discovering how difficult it is going to be to do that. Right? They were hoping that it could be done within a couple of years, and now experts are saying that it will take at least 10 years. And some people are suggesting that maybe it may never happen because of the complexities, and that the people, when they realize the costs associated with divorce, they may actually decide, well, no, we better stay, right? So that is a very interesting question there. But if you take a kind of a longer-term perspective, if you think, where were France and Germany in 1945 at the end of World War II? These are two countries that had been at war with each other, off and on, for hundreds of years. And if in 1945 you and I had gotten together and we had said, you know, there will be a time when war between these two countries will be impossible and will basically have been eliminated from the horizon, we would have been accused of being utopians, or being, you know, hopelessly unrealistic, right? Because against the background of centuries of conflict and war and armies, you know, battling it out and killing and maiming and destroying, on what basis would we on what basis would we derive optimism from that bloody history and say these countries will become peaceful and cooperative and so on? And yet that's exactly what has happened, right? Today, if anybody in Europe says that a war between France and Germany could happen, he will be laughed at, because in fact it's not going to happen, because the countries are completely integrated, because there is the highest level of political cooperation and collaboration, and because the way in which they solve their problems now is through peaceful means. It's through consultation, it's through committee meetings, it's through setting up task forces and so on. And they usually not even do it bilaterally, they do it within the context of the European Union institutions in Brussels, right? So there has been great progress within the European Union in basically coming up with systems of governance which recognize common interests and which put the collective interest higher than the national interest. I emphasize, it doesn't mean that there are no problems. Brexit in the United Kingdom, I think, had more to do with immigration than it had to do with economics. Because in fact the European Union has benefited a great deal from being a member of the European Union. The United Kingdom's most important trade partner is the European Union. The European Union is the market for, you know, a lot of the exports and the goods that the European Union that the United Kingdom produces. From an economic perspective, it has been even the immigration actually has been beneficial. You know, I was telling some friends last night, you know, that one of the reasons why many people voted to leave is because some of the pro-Brexit thinkers, leaders, were saying immigration is actually a drain on our budget. It costs money because the immigrants come and they begin to tap into our social security system and into our health system and into our schools and so on, and therefore, you know, for us it has an economic cost. That turns out to be completely false. It's completely untrue. If you actually look at the impact of immigration on the UK budget, it's actually positive, because typically the profile of the immigrant is somebody who's young, and when he moves in, he starts working, he starts contributing to the budget and to social security and so on, and paying taxes. And the value of those contributions is actually larger than the claims made by that immigrant on the budget through, you know, health expenditures and school expenditures and so on. So it's actually a positive to the budget, right? So my own sense is that when you look at the history of the European Union, when you look at where Europe was in 1945 at the end of World War II, and you see how far they have come along, you know, it has been a very, very successful experiment. You know, even on the issue of inequality, you know, we have a measure of inequality called the Gini coefficient, right? A high Gini coefficient means high levels of inequality. Some of the countries that have the lowest Gini coefficients in the world are European Union members, because they have actually facilitated convergence of the poorer members, you know, to the levels of income of the richer members. So I think it's a worthwhile experiment. Now, you mentioned Asia. I think the difference between other mechanisms of integration or other groupings of integration, there are a couple in Latin America, for instance. In Latin America, we have Mercosur, which brings together Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. There is the Alliance of the Pacific, which brings Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico together, and so on. So we have, you know, like you here in Asia, we have, you know, similar sort of processes of integration. The great difference, and the reason why they don't work so well in Asia and in Latin America, and they have worked in Europe, is because In Europe, they actually build up a whole institutional infrastructure to support the process of political and economic integration. They have a European Court of Justice. They have a European Parliament. They have an executive in Brussels called the Commission. There is a European Central Bank which for the Euro area members actually does monetary policy on a supranational basis. We don't have that in Latin America, and I don't think you have it in Asia. And so, because we don't have it in Latin America, these groupings become like talking shops, right? They bring together the heads of state, they talk, they chat, they have dinner, they have drinks, they issue a press release, they leave for the next until the next meeting. Not much happens, or very little happens, right? Whereas in Europe, they have done it in a way that is actually, much more substantial. And so, for me, I come from Latin America. For me, what I'd like us to do is basically to adopt the European model to our region and to actually begin to develop these institutional infrastructures, to facilitate the process of integration. Right? You mentioned something about pension at retirement age and so on. Look, Asian populations is something that will happen, is happening already. Initially, it was Japan, it was Italy, it was Spain, it was some of the high-income countries. But actually, it will happen, and it's already happening in other parts of the world. And China is a very good example. China has an Asian population, and it's the biggest country in the world. And there are others. There's Poland, and so on. Of course, it's not realistic to raise the retirement age until the age of 80. I meant that partly as a bit of humor, right? Because it seems so preposterous that you would actually ask people to work at the age until they are 80 years old. But it does work, actually. Maybe not to 80, but Germans already are doing it to 67, and a few other countries have plans to increase a little more, because people are living longer and people are living healthier in their older age as well. So that's one way you can do. But there are other things that can be done. For instance, we can have much more flexible work arrangements, and technology will facilitate that. You can have, for instance, much higher participation of women in the workforce, which is still much lower than men in all over the world. Women's labor force participation rate is much lower than men everywhere in the world. And in some cases by huge margins. Middle East and North Africa, Saudi Arabia, participation of men is 70%, participation of women is 20%. There's a gap of 50 percentage points. It's huge. In Iran, it's bigger. In Iran, participation of men is 71, 72%, participation of women is 17%. Right? So basically you have countries that are educating their women, which they are. Saudi Arabia, Iran, have done great efforts in bringing young women into the universities to get professions and so on. But then they don't work. They don't work because of prejudices, because of restrictions, because of all kinds of taboos and so on, lack of mobility and so on. Legal restrictions that hamper their ability to work, in very important ways. Right? So. If we were to eliminate many of these restrictions and we facilitated the integration of women into the economy, there would be more people contributing to the social security system, right? I'll give you an anecdote. I was in Moscow last April, 8 months ago, and I had a meeting with the most senior Russian official on economic policy, the Deputy Prime Minister. He's like the economic czar in Russia. He has jurisdiction over all the economic ministries. And so in the meeting he asked me, Mr. Lopez Claros, what else can we do in Russia to improve the quality of the business environment, to make it easier for the business community to thrive and to grow and to prosper? And I was prepared for that question. We had, of course, already been talking about that issue for the last hour or so. But I said, Mr. Shuvalov, what about eliminating the 456 jobs which are forbidden to women in your country? Not 5, not 10, 456, right? I didn't say 400, which seems like I was rounding the figures, right? I said 456, right? Not one more, not one less. which suggests that I have a list, right? Which of course I did have a list, right? And so he looks at me and he says, give me an example. And so I gave him several examples, and he accepted those two examples, right? And so here you have a country where there are 456 occupations which are forbidden to women. You cannot do this, you cannot do that, you cannot do this, you cannot drive the metro, you cannot drive a truck in agriculture, you cannot work in the energy sector, in the gas sector, you cannot work in oil rigs, and so on and so forth and so forth, right? And so he tells me, well, you know, some of these restrictions were introduced for the protection of women, right? Now, how does it protect you to tell you that you cannot drive the metro, you know, which is a very big infrastructure in Russia, you know, Moscow, Petersburg, and so on, they have huge metro systems, right? How is the state protecting your security, not allowing you to drive this machine, right? What is it about being a woman that somehow doesn't permit you, you know, to do this kind of thing, right? Nothing. I mean, it's just more likely the reason is that some of these are very well-paying jobs, and basically the men who make the rules are protecting the jobs for them, and they don't want women to have them, which is the reason why the wage gap is huge. Huge. The wage gap between men and women in Russia is huge, it's enormous, right? And so here you have one example, right? If you eliminate many of these job restrictions, you're going to have more women join the labor force, and then you're going to have more contributions to the pension system, and it's going to improve the financial profile of the pension system for the future. So there are things that we can do. There are things. Look, one of the things that I have learned as a public speaker is never bore your audience, because then they will remember about this professor or this gentleman who spoke forever and long, and he didn't realize that he had already lost the attention span of the audience and so on. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Also, furthermore, I'll give you another selfish reason for bringing the meeting to an end, which is that I'm actually here on holiday in Bangkok. My wife is at the hotel, and I told her I'll be back at noon so that we can go and do sightseeing in the afternoon, which is what I will do. Traffic permitting.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Claros. I think that we got a lot of more interesting questions to ask, okay? But I guess we cannot stop you from enjoying your holiday anymore. Okay. We would like to thank you, Professor, for coming for us today. Okay. Actually, this is just yesterday was our last day of the whole semester, so we are not able to have all our undergrad students to come and join. Okay, or else there'll be even more audience here. So actually, let me just introduce some of our audience here, and that is that. So you know who is here. We have the case of most of us are faculty members, okay, of Assumption University, and then most of us are coming from mainly from the Faculty of Management and Economics. Okay, we have three major departments contributing. Okay, first is from International Business Management. A while ago, Indian lady that actually gave a question to you. She's the chairperson of International Business Management, Ajahn Radha. Okay. And then we also have another chairperson from the Finance and Banking Department, Ajahn Pattathai, okay, and then her team, okay. There are other faculty members under Finance, and also my team, okay. I'm the chairperson of Business Economics Department, and a while ago, a few of the questions actually came from the case of my colleagues, okay, under the case of Economics Department. And another big group here, I believe, are lecturers from the GSL, right, okay, Graduate School of E-Learning, okay, from Dr. Firuz, and the rest will be the case of our graduate students. Okay, we have PhD students and master's students. Okay, and that's the case of our audience today. Okay, that actually come to enjoy the case of our special lecture here today. So thank you very much. Okay, please give another big applause for our Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros. Okay, thank you. You want to take? We did a group picture before that. That's why. You want another group picture then? No, it's okay. Okay. So thank you very much. And then I know this is the end of the semester. So happy holidays and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.